Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third annual WriteHive conference. My name is Jesse Pohlman, and I'm the moderator for the Geography in Worldbuilding panel. This year is jam-packed with a ton of great sessions for writers, writing professionals, and the publishing industry. WriteHive is a nonprofit serving the writing community with resources, events, programming, connections, and more. 2022 conference brings you this panel, Geography in Worldbuilding, where we will discuss all your realmscaping needs, such as how water relates to geographic features and how terrain and story follow one another. If you want to dig through the WriteHive archives for content similar to this topic, you can check out Avoiding Info Dumps in Creative Worlds and World Building with Mythology and Folklore from the WriteHive 2021 convention, as well as the January 2021 edition of WriteHive's Word Nerd podcast, Orienting Your Readers. With that in mind, once again, my name is Jesse Pohlman. I'm serving as the moderator and a panelist for this event. I have a lot of thoughts on how geography works with environments and settings and character development, because one of the things I learned as a history teacher is that trade, transport, and communication are essential things, and geography is what facilitates them. So without those things, we don't have nearly the development we do today. I am a former teacher, a history in ELA. I currently write science fiction and fantasy novels. My latest published work is actually my Lego webcomic, Chronicles of Valeron. It's a fantasy story where the world flooded, and now we're dealing with the aftermath of it. With that in mind, I'd like to pass the mic on to Joseph.
Thank you. Joseph S. Samaniego. I'm the author of the Carolingian Age book series. It's a fantasy series. And that's really the love I have is for fantasy literature and just the fantasy realm, games, everything like that. And I am also a fantasy cartographer to that end. I draw a lot of fantasy maps, have since I was a kid, you know, for either for campaigns or just watching movies, and you would see the maps or you would read them in the books, and kind of drew my love from that and world building. And I'm also a historian by actual education. I have a master's in history. So again, yeah, the whole idea of the history of humanity being built around geography is really key in that. So I got a couple ideas for some of these questions already. But I'm happy to be here.
And I'm Patty, or PL Tavormina. I'm also really excited to be here. My background is in science. I worked very different areas over the years, but most recently at Caltech in geological and planetary sciences. So I think a lot about how Earth forms, landscape forms, impact biology, life, our world, our society. And in the last few years, I've taken to writing climate fiction. Climate certainly is a big way that geology interacts with society, and geography ties into that as well. So thank you for having me here today.
It's great to have you both. It's awesome to be here. So our first question, which we're going to jump right into the questions, is why is it important to consider geography while plotting?
I'll jump in real quick. My answer is going to be pretty brief on this, but you know, I think we all can think of examples where the time it takes a character to travel through a story doesn't really line up with sort of the landscape they're traversing. Either it's too long or too short. It just doesn't make sense. For me, that can break immersion. It doesn't always, you know, it depends if I'm really invested in the character or not. But sort of in my own experience as I'm writing, I find that, you know, if you have a map laid out, and, you know, people that get involved with campaigns, they would know this through ongoing practice. But, you know, having a map, it helps you, you know, think about how a story takes shape. Who meets who, when they meet, do they meet, does anybody interact with anyone else during the winter when travel is very different than in the summer? Why are they interacting? Is it because of a trade route? Is it because of some other event? So all those sorts of things, even something as small as and detailed as a floor plan, which isn't really geography, but it's sort of in the same, area of thought. So a map tells you how people move.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Just when especially the point you made at the very beginning about the time it takes to travel, that was something on the other panel I was on. We talked about a little bit too, was actually figuring out how, especially for fantasy, a lot of horse riding. So how long would it take a horse to ride a certain amount of time, a certain distance in normal circumstances? You got to think, you're tired. The horse is going to get tired. You're going to need to stop for food, water, things like that. So the geography of that is important too, because if you're traveling there, you got to think, okay, is there a river? Is there streams? Is there a water source? Because we all need water. Every living being needs water. And then also, is it a desert? Is it shady? Do you have elements around you? So it's good to really kind of figure out the terrain and the geography or as the story gets going, or a little bit before the story gets going. And if it doesn't make sense, you really kind of you either have to do a lot of really good explaining, or you got to make it make sense. So somehow it's got to make sense.
Right. And I can see it being very different for pantsers when you talk about knowing the geography when you get started or as you're getting started. And I find it interesting that how to use the term a floor plan, because I really like that as a basis for developing how you're going to do things. I like to build Legos, and Legos have a base plate where you lay all your pieces down, and then you sort of 3D print up whatever it is you're building, be it a castle, be it a pirate ship, be it a giant robot. And we'll get to giant robots. No, we won't. But we will get to the idea that whatever you're traveling by, be it horse, be it by carriage, be it by automobile, be it by starship, you have to really consider how you get to the places, because in order to resolve conflict, you have to get to a place in the first place to actually have a chance of dealing with whatever you need to deal with as a character, and generally in real life as well. What are some major ways you've seen geography impact stories?
I think recently, I would say that watching the movie Onward, my daughter has started to really like that movie, and it's pretty cool, especially growing up fantasy. That was how my brother and I kind of were in a lot of ways with Dungeons and Dragons and other things. But watching that, almost like a subplot of that movie is where they're going to Raven's Point, and it's affected by the geography, going down the path of peril and all these other things, and then going through these caves and just the settings that they were in. It did have a lot of impact on what they did, getting to the chasm, having to cross over it and finding out which way to go. It was something that was nice to see, because it did encompass the whole idea of a fantasy story needing a map, but also needing to adapt to the terrain, which they did in various, uniquely cool ways, depending on how you want to look at it. Riding a big Cheeto that's been huge, magically enlarged down a river. It's the rule of cool is really brought in on that one. But for other things, it's cool to see how they were impacted and how they were able to solve that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that those are good points. I haven't seen that. You've added a new title for me to check out there. I think that sounds like a lot of fun. I like the idea of an expanded Cheeto to ride down the river with. What I like in when I see geography really impact stories, what I like is when it throws up a disaster, a new challenge for the character to overcome that they didn't expect. Suddenly there's who knows what, there's something there that wasn't there before, be it I guess in the movie Into the Wild, which was about Chris McCandless, he tramps off into Alaska, in the summer or in the fall, maybe, I forget, when the river is low and he's able to get pretty deep into the wilderness. He's running out of food. He's about to starve. He tries to head back home because he can't survive on his own in the wilderness anymore. And lo and behold, the river is raging, so fast and so deep, there's no way he can cross it. So I really like those examples when all of a sudden the world sort of roars at you and says, you are not in control here. We are in control. Forces beyond your control, forces that have always been here. It makes me feel very humble and like excited all at the same time to think about all those forces out there. Oh, and also another idea is, I don't know if this ties into any of the other questions better, but, when it comes to geography, it means, earth mapping, like, geo earth and graphy, sort of mapping. Part of geography is natural, but part of it is man-made, like the boundaries between kingdoms and nations. And I think those lines are interesting to think about as well, the boundary lines between nations and kingdoms, and that certainly can come into play as points of conflict and tension in stories.
Definitely.
Definitely. So I'm going to take two things Joseph said already about horse travel and about the rule of cool. I'm going to apply it to Game of Thrones. In season 1, which I'm a casual, I've only watched the HBO show, but in season 1, we see the characters cross over the King's Road and go from one place to another, and you see what a monumental adventure it is. And in other seasons, you see the same thing where they're just on this long trail. But as the action starts to reach its climax, you notice the rule of cool take over more. Suddenly people are showing up in places that it should take them months to get to, and they're showing up right on time every time. They're never late. They're never that early. They're just on time to be where the plot needs them to be. And that might be an unavoidable consequence of just the nature of resolving plots, but why couldn't there be what Patty talked about with the geographic disaster? Boulders fall down and block the road, and you have to go a different way, and that causes you to be late to the Battle of the MacGuffin. And the next thing you know, you're extending the conflict that could have maybe been resolved earlier, and you're getting more of a story out of it. Although, to be fair, that's talking more about story as it progresses. And when it comes to world building, those things need to be considered in what the characters know could happen. Things that they might think, okay, so this road might be out. What's my backup plan in case I can't get there?
Yeah, I really like that because that speaks to the characters coming in with competence and intelligence. This is a world they inhabit already. I like it when stories do that.
Yeah, I agree, and it kind of even goes to Patty's point about from Into the Wild, where the season had now come. It's probably like, I would think probably in the spring when the snows had melted, and now the river is deeper and harder to cross, if not impossible to cross. And people who travel that way or who are from that area would know that, and that would be part of the world building. So to keep it to the Game of Thrones is, if you got the Starks coming down, because I do remember Catelyn Stark is going to King's Landing from Winterfell, and it takes a long, long time because you see the progression over several episodes and the implied time, and it's a nice easy road, but then you got the other people who are traveling this road, and we don't know what lies ahead, and so there is a good element of world building that you can add in there, or you can just ignore it, and that's what unfortunately I see a lot is a missed opportunity for a lot of times with the world building and having something kind of cool, but maybe not significantly plot oriented happen, but just something that can be like, hey, that was kind of cool how our heroes dodged something there, or they had to overcome a minor inconvenience somehow.
Question number 3 is, what are your personal favorite geographic elements to write? What do you like to build into your stories?
I love ports and harbors and bays. I love oceans. I love marine style environments. Growing up where I am from North Carolina, we always had the pirate stories and marine the marine trade that we had was huge. So it was always part of our history. And so I grew up loving the idea of being near or around port cities, and even like the natural bays that form. And so I always include those in my writing and my maps for some reason. And it's probably overkill. There's always got to be like a river with a delta in it, because that's where the facilitates the trade, and like as you mentioned earlier. And I love the coastal regions. For me, I just love that they're peaceful, or can be peaceful. They can be very not peaceful too, depending on where you're at or the history. But it's also just something for me that feels like home.
Yeah, I'm drawn to those ports as well, because they get at all these different angles, like trade, like you're saying. I think we are very similar in that way. And I would say as a different take on the question, the idea of people I keep interchanging landscape for geography, and so I hope this isn't too far off, but there is this natural geography versus sort of man-made or man-influenced geography. And when you have a city, that's a built geography. When you have crowds, it's a result of cities. And the idea of crowds and people as a feature, and then even kind of drilling down there, the culture within that city, you have all these different cultural nuggets within the city, whether it's high society or the impoverished areas, or the different areas within a city. How population centers are so different. I like contrasts. So population centers is one thing, and then a remote area on the other hand, to contrast with that, because the way we are as very individuals and characters is very different in one versus the other. So those are all interesting to play with. The idea of getting lost in the wilderness is different and yet the same as getting lost in a crowd. It's like, those are two different ways to get lost. Using a crowd as a feature. Yeah, those are my thoughts about that. How about you, Jesse?
Well, lately I've been a fan of forests. I'm not quite sure why, but I feel like there's always something magical and mystical about them. Maybe it's just my early exposure to Legend of Zelda games, but I love a mystery in a forest where there's something in there and you have to go in and find out what, and in order to do so, you have to navigate. It's like the green journey into Mount Doom when you think about it. There's something in the middle of these woods and you need to get there, and you need to investigate whatever it might be, because it might be something wonderful. It might be something kind of scary, but something beneficial, or it might be just plain old terrifying. Being alone in the woods at night, I used to be a Boy Scout once upon a time. I've done my share of camping. It's so different than being in a well-illuminated suburban area where you're used to everything and you can see what's going on. It's just having just a flashlight, maybe a campfire to help you see things that might be coming at you from the dark, is a terrifying prospect. And at the same time, that's why it captures so much enthusiasm among readers.
Yeah, forests are amazing because they can turn from being welcoming to being very threatening and foreboding on a dime.
All right, question number 4. What role does water tend to play in a story? I know we've kind of hit on this a little bit, but water resources, how does that play into your world building?
And I had another thought of an example in stories, and this isn't where my thoughts went at first about water, but as we're talking, I'm thinking about oceans, and Joseph bringing up the oceans, and threats and foreboding and all that. So there was this book, and it became a movie called The Life of Pi some years ago. This character, it's really an interesting story and an interesting world building. I mean, it's this character, and most of the story he's traveling across the ocean, so that's the water. There's all the stuff at the front end and all the stuff at the back end of the story to sort of frame that, but really it's this journey on the ocean that commands so much of the story. He's alone at sea for weeks on a lifeboat with a tiger. That's just amazing. Like, think about that as a nugget for a story idea. I want to write a story about being alone on a lifeboat with a tiger. Like, what a bizarre idea. And then you have to figure out how you're going to set that up, build it, create it. What does it mean? How does it play out? How do you resolve it? But the water, because the thing that's automatically threatening, I think, to a lot of people is the presence of the tiger, which will, of course, attack you and eat you. But that's augmented. I mean, it could have been, anywhere with a tiger, but the author put it on the ocean, the middle of this vast, endless, undrinkable water. So that is an example of using this water feature to really drive home just how isolated you are. There's nowhere to run. I mean, in the end, the character shows this great intelligence by creating a raft that he tethers to the lifeboat so that he can be separate from the lifeboat with the tiger on the raft. But that's my answer to the water question. It wasn't when I was looking at these, but that's my answer now.
I have to say, for me, for the water, I kind of it goes back to when I was a student, many years ago, and in history, our history begins as city builders with water. We built near water. The nomadic tribes would follow the water, or follow the animals to the watering holes and just gather there and hunt there. But then it just started building there, and that kind of leads into, Patty, what you were saying too earlier about the human influence on geography with building cities, because without water, we wouldn't have built those cities. You look at cities, I guess the first true city being I think I'm pronouncing that correct, the Sumerian city. And we're talking about thousands of years ago, and it being built near the water because that was the life-giving source. So for me, in a story, if I find a story, any story I'm doing, the major cities are all near water. These waterways, they're rivers, or they're at least lakes, something that has the ability to irrigate the farms, give fresh water to the inhabitants. And then even if, like I said, we're going to port cities, which are very important to most civilizations, because they have to have some kind of trade with other nations, especially when you look at the aspect of a road could be dangerous because of bandits, or it could just be further because you have to go further around if you're taking the continental route. What's quicker, you go here, or taking the sea. And so you're now utilizing the ocean for trade, and everything just draws back to the idea that water is our most important resource on the planet, besides possibly air, which also has water in it, or vice versa. Water has oxygen in it. So you got the two most important resources we have there is water and air. And so for a story to ignore those points is kind of, it just doesn't seem realistic to me, in that aspect.
Yeah, so I want to build off of something Patty said about Life of Pi, and I want to build off of how ancient cities were built, and that's people like to have control of things. And just like you might want to have control of the tiger that you're on a raft with, that you build a second raft so you're not on the raft with the tiger, we have historically as a species tried to control water. We build canals so that we can improve our navigation. We build dams so we can build, well, nowadays it's for power, but even in the past it could be used to build reservoirs to provide water for people. And it's in so many ways a double-edged sword, because all it takes is for the dam to just get old and get a little worn down, and you've got not just a stored water source, but a flood coming at you downhill with all of those years of water built up backing it, or however long it's been that it took that dam to fill up and that lake to fill. Now it's coming at you downhill. It's the same thing with rain in some climates where they don't necessarily get a lot of rain. and then the soil is not ready to absorb more water, which means all of that water just goes downhill and forms into giant mudslides, which how do you even begin to prepare against that? How can people control that? And the best thing they can do is just sort of build in there just in cases, which is kind of an important thing. It's our ability to look into the future and make predictions.
That's it. That's really cool. The idea of how we do try to control it. That's true. That's good.
All right, so we're up to question 5, if I'm not mistaken. And question 5 is getting a little more specific. We've touched on this in general, but we're going to go deep now. How can a geographic setting determine vital or otherwise interactions such as trade, transport, and communication?
Well, I think one of the, I guess the major, especially looking at the otherwise on that aspect, in fantasy literature, we always have, dwarves are common, and most dwarf civilizations are mining based, are underground. So it's the whole mountain aspect or the I guess cavernous aspect of the geography there. Their whole world and their whole civilization is built upon the riches that they find in the earth, throughout the earth. And even in video games, Dragon Age, the series, and I know in Dragon Age Origins they did talk about a lot, because you were actually in the dwarven civilizations underground, and they had roads connecting them. So they built these hollowed out roads into the earth to do the trade, to do transport, to do communication, to do all those important things. And the whole idea was going outside was almost like a negative aspect, going out into the world, because you'll fall into the sky. I just love the way that sounds. Honestly, sounds very fantasy oriented in itself. But you always have that, and then on the flip side of that, you have a lot of the fantasy realm type genres put in elves in trees, or living in trees, more folk in the oceans or in rivers, things like that. They're always tied. Humans are always tied to the cities, and everywhere else is tied to certain aspects of nature or aspects of the earth. So I think that geography almost helps really build the other species that we see in literature and in movies and games.
Yeah, I think I want to focus on the communication end of this question. I think the trade is fascinating. It's so fundamental, and transportation. Communication is really interesting. So when you say, Jesse, when you talk about drilling in a little bit, I'm going to drill in on that, because we need to have people communicating in our stories, and of course we all use dialogue, person-to-person communication. That's common. We may or may not have. I write science fiction. I don't write fantasy, so some of the conventions are a little bit different, and we each tend to try to evoke a certain time period. So in a lot of fantasy, that might feel medieval-esque. Not all fantasy, but some of the Dungeons and Dragons end of things tends to feel like horses and all that. But there's lots of other stories as well in fantasy and science fiction. With science fiction, we might have telephones. I try to avoid things like telephones. I think it's interesting to figure out how to get past these challenges. So maybe we have mail delivered by horseback. Maybe we have a courier who can travel on horseback more quickly if he has a single message or she has a single message to deliver to a specific location. Maybe there's air transport. Maybe there isn't. As you start to think about all these different ways of communicating, it impacts how landscape and geography can impact it. Is there wireless communication? Is there telepathy on the world? Is there a telegraph? And then I started thinking, well, what about things like fire towers? They did this, I forget if it was Lord of the Rings. One of them, you set the fire towers to send the signal. What was that in? Was that Lord of the Rings?
Yeah, the Return of the King.
Okay,
Film of Lord of the Rings, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that you guys are historians, so I think that's based on historical truth.
Yeah, there were some examples of that. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and then also, when I was a kid, we used to talk about smoke signals, and I don't know if that's historically accurate or not. but presumably people would use smoke. So this would allow you to use visual cues to send signals across distance, or animals to carry information, like homing pigeons or whatever it is. I feel like we have all these different ways to send communication. Now, the way geography impacts this is things like, well, obviously with the fire towers, you need to have high points that people can on the next one can see. You need to plan where those are going to be. And then again, anything that impedes travel is going to naturally make, increase the amount of time. And then also last thing is we haven't talked about desert really, but a desert, that's an important geographical feature. If you leave a planet and go out into space, even in science fiction, I'm sure there are plenty of people interested in writing in space and that are writing in space. It seems like in science fiction, they always bring in some currently impossible tech, like the subspace communication on Star Trek, or something. I think Ursula Le Guin invented an Ansible or used an Ansible. I'm not too clear on what that is, but I think it's all to get at this limitation of the fact that it's impossible to communicate instantaneously once you're in space. So that's a real problem.
I love that you brought up space, because the speed of light is only so fast, and that's the speed that information travels at least according to known physics. I'm going to take us back down to Earth. I'm going to take us back down to something not quite maritime, but definitely something water related. You've got a river, right? And that river is wide enough that it's navigable. It's deep enough that it's navigable. You can have boats on it for more than just rowing around. You can have relatively large ships on it. Let's just throw this hypothetical river out there. That river is going to be a conduit of information as well as resources and goods. It's just like an artery in your body. It's bringing information through. It's also bringing things through like disease, so it's like a body in that way as well. But that kind of comes with the idea of, if we increase how much contact we're in, we'll understand each other better and we'll get more out of each other. So the river is the bloodstream, at least until you invent railroads. Then you've got something completely different you're playing with, which you still need to stop at a river once in a while to get water, but becomes a little less of a challenge. Alrighty, moving right along. Question number 6. What are some ways that geographic and even geological forces can impact your story? So we're drilling down into the core of the planet now.
I think it was kind of touched on earlier too about, disasters happening, and obviously we don't control nature. We don't control the earth. The earth is going to do, the earth is kind of, to hit on the point you were just making, the earth is a living body, and we are just living on it. So the earth is going to do what the earth's going to do. And whether that's our earth or an earth in a fantasy world, or even in a whole nother galaxy, even these planets, and they're going to do what they're going to do. It's just their natural way. So earthquakes are going to happen, storms and the mudslides and just trees falling down for whatever reason they may be. Had one fall behind my apartment the other day, and just because of the wind that we had some strong winds from those storms that caused tornadoes not too long ago, and it just pushed a tree down. So it's going to happen. And I think that being that that's so realistic, adding that to a story just adds to the immersion and adds to the realism of what the reader is going to read, because they can relate to it. They may have known those experiences. They may have seen a hurricane, or may have been in hurricanes, or they may have been in earthquakes. These are scary forces, because these are things that we can't control. And that's one of the first things you do when you can't control something, is you fear it. And unfortunately, that's the start of a lot of bad progression. But when it comes to these, the forces from nature, they're there, and we have to live with them. So having characters in a story live with them and adapt to them many ways. I remember reading something about I want to say it was in Thailand, that people would actually know, they could see the signs of when tsunamis were coming, and they were able to move out of the way in time because they were able to read the signs. They'd been there for so many generations that they just knew what to look for, and they knew how things felt. Watching the animals react, you see the animal birds flying away from things usually means that they're flying away from danger. Just visual cues that we can add to stories about the world around us to help the reader kind of just feel part of it.
Yeah, I like the idea of adapting, Joseph. I think that's really important. I think that's what it is, and I feel like that's what I keep coming back to with geography, is that land does change. It's static and stable in one sense, and that's why we make a map, so that we can plan out routes and trade and all that. But these forces can be very unpredictable. They can make a character change course, or they can force a choice. So to go back to Lord of the Rings, I believe there's a moment in the Fellowship of the Ring where the band needs to decide if they're going to go through the mountain or around the mountain, and they weigh the pros and cons of both, and they make their choice, and that leads to a set of circumstances they wouldn't have faced if they made the other choice. And as a plotter, I love all that. I love thinking, okay, let's see what the consequences are of each choice that's being made. But in terms of unpredictability, you can have geographical features can change as a result of a geological force. So, as an example, an earthquake. An earthquake can come randomly, and now a character may need to change their priorities. Just, they think they're acting toward their primary goal. Now an earthquake hits the city, and they either continue on their primary goal, or they decide to check on their family back home and make sure everybody's okay, which is a different, understandable, relatable goal. So these forces can add a lot. And Joseph, you're saying basically saying the same thing. But even in a predictable setting, things can change. So I would also give an example of an arduous sea crossing that is going to take 3 months. There's a potential, and that's going into it, that that you might run out of fresh water. There might be a disease take hold on the boat, and so even in a predictable setting, some of these features can change what the character has to deal with. All of which is good for storytelling.
I love the mention of tsunamis and earthquakes because they're so tied together, and they're so monumental to human life that humans have ascribed these phenomenon and many others to supernatural levels. They've taken things like earthquakes and volcanoes and basically deified them. It's understandable, right? Because these things are so powerful and dangerous, but also beautiful, that they really warrant that kind of consideration as something divine, or at least divinely created. Speaking of things that seem divinely created but have relatively mundane things, think about that river that I mentioned earlier. Give it a long time, 50 million years or so. That river is going to be drilling down into the ground, eroding it, creating possibly a giant canyon. And that might be where an entire new group of people with different cultural, religious, and social beliefs lives, because it's no longer a great place for a city, but it's a great place for a small group of people to survive off the land.
You know what? Yes, one thing this is the geography panel, and so I keep trying to think of geographical forces. But as you're talking, Jesse, about deifying some of these forces, it reminds me of growing up in Tornado Alley. I grew up in Tornado Alley, and I always wondered, why did tornadoes happen here? And there must be a geographical component. It's just the way the weather systems form as a result of the mountains or the plains or whatever. So you end up getting these atmospheric forces that make it more likely to have a tornado, which some people call the finger of God. That's I know I've heard that before. And lightning strikes. Some areas are more prone to thunderstorms and lightning strikes, which are also sometimes deified. So this isn't the weather panel. This is the geographical panel. But I feel like
a weather panel.
I feel like it applies. Yeah.
All right. If there's nothing else, we're going to turn our attention to something that might be a little tricky. What are some common mistakes writers make concerning geography, and how can you avoid them?
I'm very curious to hear what Joseph has to say about that, because he is a cartographer. I will say that when I designed my world map, I was very conscientious of where the snow should fall, where the water should drain, where the lakes should form, and all of that kind of stuff. And I went on YouTube and watched endless videos about what makes a good coastline, what makes a good mountain range, and what these things mean in terms of the broader world. But so the rookie mistakes I see is random map making, and I'm just going to let Joseph pick it up from there.
Yeah, there's the cartography community is going to have my head for this probably, but no, in all seriousness, yeah, there's certain rules that are unofficial and suggested. There's no real hard rules if you can explain it or if you can give a reason for it. Especially if you're doing fantasy maps, there could be a supernatural reason. So there you go. I try to follow as many realistic conventions as possible with making my map. My rivers need, just for me, just for my own personal mental, perfectionist aspect of everything, the rivers have to flow the right way. The mountains there cannot just be a single, sorry, Tolkien, there cannot just be a single lonely mountain by itself. It just, and I know there's some cases in history where it's like, okay, that's a big mountain and everything else is kind of small around it, but there's still plate tectonics there making it happen. I have to have like the hillscape with it and the mountains there. I would say that some of the things that I follow, and if anyone asks me for advice, the number one thing I will always say is there's no straight lines in the world here. The straight lines don't exist on real maps because the Earth doesn't really do perfect straight 90-degree angles. I will say that there's a part of France that almost has it right there, the Bay of Biscay. It's very close to being a straight line. But that's the only example I've ever seen. And I'm lucky because I have a very prominent shake to my hands. It's just some genetic. And so my coastlines are very, very well rigid because I just can't draw a straight line to save my life at this point anymore. So my coastlines are really my favorites. And that's why I say it's like if you're going to create a map, or if you're going to build a world with this geography, try to follow the same rules in a sense that the Earth follows. I know the Earth doesn't really follow rules, but just let the rivers drain the way they're supposed to drain. They're going to flow a certain way on Earth. Kind of mimic that. Study atlases and study geography. There's a great YouTube that deals a lot with that as well. But try to make everything have common sense is really the biggest thing. There's a lot that people really want to do. They want to have that really high mountain that's this Mount Everest in the middle of the desert. And it's like, but okay, I guess that would be great for storytelling, but does that really work in a geographical sense? And honestly, I wouldn't be able to really answer that. I guess it could, but for me, it's just make something make common sense is really the biggest thing for me to avoid making these really drastic mistakes. It's just common sense.
I love that. Oh, sorry.
Well, I was just curious about whether sometimes I see also see trade errors, like people putting a town in the middle of nowhere, and it's like, well,
Oh yeah.
I'm curious if you guys see that. But Jesse, I shouldn't interrupt, so
That's
go
cool.
ahead.
Okay. So I love that point about rivers flowing the right way. I think I've been guilty of that in my younger days. But I guess the biggest mistake people make is that world building is fun, right?
Mhm.
Playing with your settings geography is a blast, and designing where things are going to be. I can't draw it for anything. I still draw maps of what I'm thinking of, and then hope that I can figure out a way to get it made later if I like what I do. But you build up such a world, and then a lot of times writers only explore a small slice of it, and readers don't necessarily even encounter what's outside. They don't know it exists. It's just sort of there. And if there's one mistake that I would encourage people not to make, it's don't overthink your world. Don't underthink it, definitely, because then you get rivers flowing the wrong way. But do not overthink it either, because unless you know you're going somewhere with that particular geographic feature, even if you're just going to bring it in as a historical topic for the kingdom or whatever, consider whether or not it needs to be in your story, unless maybe you're planning for a series or something. But even then, start with the first book and work your way up.
Yeah, and Patty, I'd like to make a comment on what you said about the trade and having a city kind of like in the middle of nowhere, and we've seen that. It's actually something that's pretty common in fantasy literature and in fantasy campaigns. Almost the way I look at it is I look at it like ancient Egypt, and you had these small settlements and various size settlements, and some of them were near oases because you had various places where I guess the groundwater would rise up to make this oasis. And then they were able to build cities around, or maybe not cities, but little villages and towns around that. And the only thing I would say is that just make that known. If you're going to write that and you have this really large Sahara style landscape, make that known that, hey, there's this oasis there with life-giving water that people huddle around. And that's why this is a way stop location for this trade caravans. They stop here because they can refill their water and stuff, and just make it part of the story. It takes all of one paragraph, basically. So yeah, it's definitely, but it is common to have that. And a lot of it is just to help the plot drive and things like that, but it's just make them 1-2 sentences to explain it. That's all. That's my advice on that.
All right. On the fly, I'm going to ask number 9 instead of number 8. What might be some genre considerations to keep in mind? I know we've talked a lot about fantasy already, but what about if there's anything interesting about stellar geography that you might consider? Any sort of thoughts in that sci-fi direction?
Well, the interesting things are the gravity wells once you're in space, and the solar radiation, and just all the new forces that you have to deal with once you're out there. And people do interesting things. If we're going to skip over to even beyond science fiction, there was a really interesting sort of book. I forget what it was called. It was called something like Packing for Mars or something. And the two problems the woman was trying to get around was, how do you have enough food to take astronauts to Mars and back again? And then how do you survive all the radiation? And her solution was, you pack all the food around the hull of the ship, so that whatever the food is absorbing the radiation. So it was something like that, so then you have the food to eat, but it's also acting as your shield, which, like, that's a solution that I don't think we have ever come up with on Earth, because these are challenges that we've never faced on Earth. So I found that interesting. But then also the communication issue, I think that's going to be a major. You see it in science fiction all the time, where people take liberties with communication, and they're like, well, we can talk instantaneously with Earth. We can email them on Earth. It's like, well, probably not, but we'll allow it for the story.
I think a lot of times they can get away with those things because most of these stories are 500 years into the future, and it's kind of like, well, how can we say what we can do then? But at the same time, I've always wondered about, it takes what, 6 months to get to Mars, I think.
I think it's 6 or 8. I think
Yeah.
something like that.
So obviously, going back and forth, we're talking, yeah, I know we used to do across the Atlantic 3 months, give or take, or something like that. Going to Mars back and forth, if you're thinking it's going to take you almost 2 years round trip, basically, if you're talking 8 months at the high end, you're almost 2 years. Going to a planet outside of our local solar system, is there even a possibility of, I guess it's the whole aspect of fashion like travel. How does that work into it, and what considerations do you have for that? Because even if you're going one way, you come back. I mean, you're talking about your kid being a grandparent possibly.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
and things like that. So how does that even play into the using geography? How does that play into your psyche as far as you growing up, you mentally being able to adjust to that? Talking earlier, we mentioned about being in the forest and how that changes from being a welcoming place that you want to explore to now being a scary place that you want to just run from. And it's almost the same way with space, same way with the oceans even.
Yeah, it's interesting because I see that as like opening up a new sort of category of stories to think about telling, because now we're going to, instead of talking about traveling and seeing stuff, now we're talking about generational ships and not returning, which is kind of a different, it's not a quest. I mean, it's kind of a quest, but with a quest in a fantasy setting, so, it's like, well, we got rid of the ring, or we found the, Holy Grail or whatever. Instead, it's like, no, we're leaving Earth and we will never see a planet again. And that's it's interesting, but maybe our children will set foot on a new world that we will never see,
Well, yeah, it's like the whole Wall-E aspect of living 700 generations or whatever, away from Earth. And here it is, we've changed and the world's changed, the world obviously changed, but we've changed ourselves into a whole new, almost new, species of human.
Yeah. So you can get into identity and all sorts of interesting new little nuances of character and story.
Yeah. So I'm going to tie this back to mistakes people made. I created a science fiction setting in the 2480s thinking, yeah, it gives humanity time to colonize some stars, build some ships. Then I listened to this guy named Isaac Arthur. He's on YouTube. He's a scientist type guy who talks pretty exclusively about like how sci-fi technology really works. And I'm like, I should not have set this in the 2480s, maybe the 24,080s, but no way. And I should have had way more O'Neill cylinders than I should have had colonized planets. And it's just like, you take liberties with sci-fi future tech because it creates the story, right? The admiral can get to the next place she needs to be before, time runs out because you got faster than light travel. You hand wave that away. You hand wave away all of these physics considerations for the sake of the story, but at the same time, it ties back to something that was said earlier about rules and how even then, even if you're making up whole cloth technologies that may not physically be possible, you still should give them some sort of rules in order to have a concrete understanding of what's up with regards to what can and cannot happen, at least under the technology of the time. Maybe it can get improved upon, but if you can only make it from planet A to planet B we were talking about getting to Mars in 6 months, right? Faster than a light engine, you can get there in very fast. Your biggest problem is slowing down when you're on your way.
Yeah.
It changes the rules, which is fine, but it should take the same amount of time to get there per trip unless things change in the status quo.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
I was
No.
going to say, I think the 8 months is when Earth and Mars are closest. So you could, yeah. When we're furthest apart, obviously it's much longer. That's all. There's a window, but that's another thing to consider is the launch window.
Yeah, it's just like the tides. When
Right.
they would leave,
Yeah.
they would say, "Hey, we got to go with the optimal tide." And yeah, because I always kind of wondered about how does the body react with hyperspace or with warp? How is that livable? And obviously, you could shield something. You're putting shields up for the solar radiation, so obviously you can put shields up for any kind of possible radiation that may happen with these warp engines that are taking your body thousands of miles a second almost. I guess the biggest thing for me is just also if it makes sense, if you can explain it to a point where the reader can understand it and be like, okay, I'm not an astrophysicist, but sure, that makes sense. Then it works. I mean, we know that we're building engines every day. We have trains in other countries that are running basically off the rails, because not literally off the rails, but like they're hovering above the rails because of just using these magnetic forces. Something that we couldn't do when we first obviously built trains. We were using coal and diesel, or not diesel, but coal and steam, and then we switched over to diesel, and now we're using these electrical and components, and it's just amazing what we could do. I mean, not even really just 117 years ago or so, 100 a little more than that now, I guess. We flew for the first time, and in a plane. Yeah, we actually had hot air balloons before that, but we flew a plane for the first time. So Jules Verne stuff kind of started making sense. Really, it started making a lot more sense, and submarines are not even 200 years old yet. So it's the same thing. If you can make it make sense, whether it's for the geography, whether it's for the city building, the world building, or even for just the science behind it, if it can make some kind of sense, somebody in a few more decades will probably build it like they built cell phones and tablets off Star Trek. Basically, we'll build it somehow.
Just made me think about my great-grandfather, who was a submariner in World War I, and how one of the things you have to consider in your world building is, all right, let's say you can get somewhere using some fancy technology. What are the conditions like? Like a World War I submarine was not at all as comfortable as a modern submarine, which from what I understand, not being a submarine person, but from what I've read, is really still kind of awful and not fun. And being in a spaceship might really be awful and not fun, and might not be this glorious Clark Tech, we have gravity situation. There are entire franchises that don't have gravity on their spaceships because that technology either hasn't been invented or is simply impossible.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it almost looks like the Star Trek, ships almost look like a pleasure cruise at some points.
Yeah.
They really do. And yeah, I was actually reading about a submarine captain from World War I recently that they contributed his death to all the diesel that he was breathing in over those years. So It wasn't a very good space to be in. So yeah, definitely. And think about the Apollo capsules, how cramped those were. And, I wonder what's going to be like in the 2500s for space travel. Should be interesting.
I hope to live to see it.
Be better man than me.
That had its own costs. For question 8, which is now question 9, and this is your chance to really leave our listeners with something they can take home and bank upon. What are your top tips, the things most important for you for planning geography in a story setting or secondary world?
I'm going to jump in with my top tip being something we haven't touched too much on, which is to make the immediate setting So the landscape in which a hero lives and works and spends his or her time, to make that setting work for you, to emphasize the story highlights or the theme. So if it's a theme or if it's a theme about isolation, think about how the landscape can emphasize that for you, because it's another tool to pull in. I think it's really helpful to bring in setting as a character. Sometimes you hear people talk about setting being a character. I just think setting and landscape is so powerful in that way. But I'm also going to tuck in a second tip, which is not my top tip, but my second tip is really to do have a map, or do even have a floor plan. You know, when I had a floor plan of the inn where a lot of my action takes place. It takes place at a country inn. And I was randomly having people, you know, out the back door, out the front door, through the window, in the washroom, all this kind of stuff. When I forced myself, I had to force myself to draw the floor plan of the inn, I realized that half of what I had written made no sense at all. I had to redo the floor plan. I had to change a few plot points. It's subtle, but I think we're capable, when we're reading, of feeling like that doesn't make sense. What does it mean he could see through the back door into the fire, into the front room? You know, that doesn't make sense. So I would really encourage people to think about maps and floor plans.
Yeah, I would say, and I've probably said it several times, it's just, you know, have something that makes sense in your mind, and ask others what they think. Get opinions from others that know about the genre or know about the world you're trying to make, especially if you're maybe doing a campaign for Dungeons and Dragons or any other tabletop, or you're trying to write a book. Get advice. Don't be afraid to bounce ideas off people and just to see what they think, because what you're going for may not exactly capture the mind of someone else as much as it's capturing your mind, but then what they have may improve it and may make it more spectacular. So definitely be open to that, to the ideas, and make something that feels good for you, but also that others can feel welcomed in. Unless you're a DM trying to make them not feel welcomed, and then something that makes them feel not so welcomed in, if that's what you're going for. But try to get that aesthetic that you're going for, just like kind of actually, and then also, like you said earlier, Jesse, have fun with it. You know, just have fun.
It's a lot of fun when the cat crawls on you in the middle of a panel. It's great. It's
Cats
my
are
favorite
great.
thing in the world. It's her first appearance at WriteHive. I have a different cat who appeared at the first WriteHive, but that's a whole other story. I loved what Patty said about thematic impact. I think that is something that I can just only stress, and something that works for you is an essential point as well. It has to make sense for you, because it has to fit a certain vibe that you're going for with your work. You know, a tip that comes to me quite often is, and this comes from John Adamus, is that writing is the act of making decisions. And when you're plunking down a river like this is SimCity, what you're really doing is you're making a decision about how your plot structure is going to go, how your entire situation is going to unfold, what's going to happen in your plot, what your themes are going to be. You know, if you've got this world set up so that there's just an endless desert in one community, they're always going to be afraid of running out of water. They're going to be afraid of anything that might come from outside, because of course they'll be afraid of things that come from outside. There's not much that does. So thematic impact is definitely a huge thing that I can just really only echo. Okay, so does anyone have any other thoughts that just popped into their head randomly that they think would be useful for our writer and reader friends to hear?
I think we said a lot of good information here.
All right, then one more time, where can people find you?
Well, I'm all over social media. You can find me on my YouTube channels and Joseph S. Samaniego, and hopefully there'll be more panels soon.
All of my handles are PL Tavormina. So Twitter, Instagram, my website. And I'm often on Twitter. I enjoy it. People talking about nonsense. I enjoy it.
All right. I am definitely available on Twitter at jpohlmanwriting. My website is also jpohlmanwriting.com. It's got links to all my books and my webcomic and everything. And there should be links in the description to this video to everything that everyone's put in. And that should just about do it. I want to thank you both again for joining me on this adventure. And I would like to thank everyone who's watched, listened, however you've consumed the content. Thank you. I hope we were able to help you learn something in your writing today. Any farewell words?
Thank you. This has been a lot of fun today.
Yep. Thanks. And thanks for listening.
All righty, friends. That's it. Pieces.